Good. My aim this evening is to introduce the Analects, the text most closely associated with Confucius. I hope to give a sense of some key themes in the Analects by focusing on the kind of knowledge that the Confucians found useful. This conception of knowledge has not been fully explored in Anglophone philosophical literature, and I believe the Analects provides an opportunity for us to think about the place and function of different types of knowledge. Therefore, instead of introducing a smorgasbord of ideas from the Analects, the approach I take here is to have a more focused discussion of its epistemological concerns. From this angle, I'll bring together a number of its main themes. So my approach here differs from most introductions to the Analects, which typically begin by exploring its moral commitments. Instead, I investigate its views from the angle of knowledge. Although the Analects does not offer a theory of knowledge, it says quite a bit about learning, a process that's referred to in scholarly work as self-cultivation. Much work has been done in this space on self-cultivation, especially in connection with the nature of Confucian moral life. So the primary question I want to consider really connects up with moral philosophy, but it does so through Confucian epistemology. And the question I want to look at is, how does knowledge enhance the moral life of a community? So let me say a little bit about the Analects to begin with. As the title implies, the text contains the conversations of Confucius. There are 20 short chapters. They're not organized in any form. Within these 20 chapters, there are 499 passages, and the majority of them seem to be records of conversations with Confucius. But I suggest we should think of the Analects more along the lines of the conversations of Confucius according to the followers in the tradition, rather than actual records of conversations with Confucius. As scholars doubt the person Confucius had any involvement in the composition of the text, and we don't know if he actually made the comments attributed to him. So the conversations are likely to have been written by early followers who leant on Confucius's authority to give greater weight to their claims. So in the Analects, there's typically an interlocutor comes to ask Confucius a question, and in response, Confucius speaks authoritatively, indicated by the phrase, Confucius says, a phrase of reference in the Confucius says jokes we come across today. Confucius, the Latinized version of Kongzi or Confuzi, is believed to have lived between 551 and 479 BCE. The earliest versions we have of the Analects date from the 3rd century BCE, and there are many versions of it. That was the way that the texts then were transmitted. People copied and they made mistakes, or they copied shorter versions because the bamboo slips were lighter to carry if they weren't the whole bundle. So there are many versions of it. I thought I'd show you this image of an early version that was discovered in Pyongyang in 1992. So you see they go down, the script goes down the bamboo strips. And so in terms of the transmission and the circulation of the text, not only do we have many versions of the text, we also have many versions of the texts with commentaries. And this was the way scholars or thinkers engaged with the text. They liked the ideas, they thought, why not add a few comments to distill some of the ideas in the text. And so the Analects comes with layers and layers of commentary through time, and scholars tend to see these commentaries as at least as important as the text itself, because they're layers of accretion across time. The current most widely circulated version is based on He Yan's commentary produced in the 3rd century CE. Confucius would have been surprised to learn that he would subsequently be thought of as the founding figure of a unique tradition of thought with global fame 2,500 years later, and whose ideas have been captured in the influential text, the Analects, along with many commentaries. Here's a slide with a commentary, interesting one that's dated to 890 CE. This is the front page of chapter 9 of the Analects, and I want to show you how the commentaries work. So that's the main text, and these little lines are the commentaries, main text and commentaries, and it's extremely rich. So scholars will talk about different versions of the text that circulated with the commentaries. Apparently, this was a schoolboy's work. What is the Analects about? Some, if not most, of the Analects authors were political advisors, and therefore many conversations center on the role and attributes of a person who could provide advice to those who govern. The text is grounded in the Confucian ideal of a ruler who embodies and thus models morally appropriate behaviors and practices. Ideally, his beneficence extends to all, and the people respond positively by developing a commitment to benevolence as well. The Analects is not optimistic about this ideal scenario, however. Its conversations center on how a person in an advisory capacity prepares himself for a supportive role. We read about the many concerns of those who are trying hard to understand their responsibilities and tasks in undertaking this role. Perhaps rulers might reject the advice given to them by these advisors, or perhaps they do not fully grasp the Confucian vision. What do the advisors do then? In view of this, the Confucius figure is upheld in the text as a mentor and guide to his followers. His statements are sometimes disapproving, sometimes edifying, aiming to point them in the right direction. The advisors would have been expected to reliably handle a range of matters associated with their roles. From a Confucian perspective, these would have included a range of roles, including maintaining a commitment to the people, proposing measures that would enable human flourishing, advising the ruler, perhaps even remonstrating with the ruler, allocating tasks to the common people, acting and speaking with tact and decorum, having successful personal relationships. And this is just a sample. The Analects speaks of how difficult it is to be in this position. The Confucian exemplary person, the Junzi, was sandwiched between the people on the one hand and the leader he aimed to support on the other, serving two masters. Zixia, one of Confucius's followers, said of this role, "Only once exemplary persons have won the confidence of the common people do they work them hard. Otherwise, the people will think themselves exploited. Only once they have won the confidence of their lord do they remonstrate with him. Otherwise, their lord would think himself maligned." There were other issues the early followers grappled with as well, including, for example, what can be done with colleagues who do not pull their weight? When is it appropriate to modify practices, and how do you decide which ones are outdated? When might it be time to give up the role if the official you're supporting refuses to take your advice? Because one needed to juggle all these demands and obligations, learning to handle the challenges would have been a very difficult endeavor. And therefore the text talks a lot about learning. And what does learning involve? The complexity of the advisor's role prompts the question, how might one prepare oneself for it? A central theme in the Analects is that a person learns by observing the behaviors and actions of others, with a mentor such as Confucius to guide their reflections on behaviors, telling them when something is acceptable or unacceptable, admirable or deplorable, and so on. Much of these work for the early learners would have involved observing and thinking about how others have handled tasks and interacted with people in exemplary or not so exemplary ways. Examples might be observed firsthand, or one might have read about them, or one might have heard about them from others. In fact, I believe the Analects itself would have served as a compendium or a repository of examples. And this is how I suggest we as modern readers should understand the text as well. It is not a manual for the good life, but a book rich with examples of how people encountered life. Through its conversations, the text offers an empirical approach to moral life. Empirical, that is, in that it focuses on what goes on in the world around us and thinks about and through concrete examples, rather than take an approach that is guided by ideals. The Analects says quite a bit about learning in this empirically oriented way. And I've charted its references to learning activities, and here is a long list. I can't guarantee it's exhaustive, but it's all in the Analects. One looks, and here the sense of looking is look around. One listens, asks, observes, and observe is a more guided looking. Read, discuss, rehearse, examine the self, cultivate, learn, practice, and reflect. Some of these forms of learning probably have greater weight than others. For instance, if you see learning third from the bottom, it's not always the case, but very often the case that shui, which we typically take as learning in the Analects, is often thought of in terms as passive absorption of information. Not always, but quite frequently. And in passages you can find shui, for instance, that passive learning contrasted with reflection. Thinking about these activities highlights the complexity of learning. The Analects is not naive about the difficulties of learning from observed behaviors. There are discussions of people whose actions are formulaic and of others whose moral commitments are not quite what they seem, in spite of incorrect behaviors. It's clear from these scenarios that without the right kinds of guidance, there is no way learners can proceed. There's just a lot of information. For instance, what should learners attend to when they look or when they read? What kinds of cues should they pick up from their environments? This is why Confucian philosophy places much weight on the moral environments in which we live. In brief, if we live in a community in which the Confucian values such as benevolence, rightness, ritual propriety, wisdom, and reliability are manifest, we're of course more likely to come across more positive moral exemplars more often. And it is through our familiarity with these role models that we develop a sense of benevolence, rightness, and propriety, amongst other Confucian virtues. Perhaps this account of moral cultivation sounds rather circular. We look at behaviors in a guided way to learn about virtuous action. We reflect on these to develop a sense of what the virtues entail. In turn, our moral commitments, developed in this way, inform our judgment about morally appropriate behaviors. So it sounds a bit inbred, so to speak. It's self-perpetuating. It's a system that seems to be self-perpetuating. So perhaps, maybe let us consider an example closer to home. How do we love someone? We learn to love by observing loving actions, or not loving actions. Sometimes we're the beneficiaries of loving actions. Exposure to a wide variety of possible ways of demonstrating love is critical to our understanding of what love is. Demonstrations of negligence or lack of love will also inform our conceptions of love. In our own practice, when we love someone, we may use the patterns of behaviors we're familiar with, or we may create new ways to love others. There is a lot that goes in there, of course, including the influences around us that shape us. Thinking about this should help foreground why the quality of a moral community is a critical feature of Confucian philosophy. The learning processes set out in my earlier list point us to the sources of information. But it is the moral life of the community that shapes our understanding of what it means to be moral. Although it may be thought that this vision places too much weight on moral traditions, it is important to take heed of this Confucian insight into how our moral views are shaped by our exposure to the models of behavior around us, whether positive or negative. Returning to this list of learning processes, let's consider a second feature of learning in the Analects. From this list, even at a glance, we get a sense that the text is deeply cognizant of the fact that practicalities are a significant part of our moral lives. As we have just noted, from a Confucian perspective, our experiences need to be undergirded by guidance provided in the community. Yet, even if this is the case, there is a practical question of how life's rich detail is to be aptly integrated into our practices. The Analects is aware that learning does not always generate appropriate action. And here is a passage about people who are learned but who fail to perform effectively. The master said, if people can recite all of the 300 odes and yet when given official responsibility fail to perform effectively, or when sent to distant quarters are unable to act on their own initiative, then even though they've mastered so many of them, what good are they to them? At the heart of this problem is the inability of people to respond appropriately in light of the circumstances. Confucius regrets that people lack initiative, even if they have good resources to hand, as the passage implies. And a number of passages in the Analects express anxiety about people being in a quandary. The idea of taking appropriate action on the basis of relevant considerations is a significant theme in the Analects. It is expressed in the character E, which I've translated rightness. Here, it has also sometimes been translated as appropriateness, doing what is appropriate or doing the right thing. So what do we need to know, and how does knowledge have a role in our coming to do the right thing? In my research, I've suggested that the epistemological approach of the Analects is best captured by the idea of knowing to. Let me introduce this by way of two examples from the Analects. One negative, that is showing a lack of knowing to, and the other positive. The master was in the state of Chen, and he said, "Homeward, homeward. My young friends at home are rash and ambitious, while perhaps careless in the details. With the lofty elegance of the literatus, they put on a full display of culture, but they don't know how to cut and tailor it." These comments emphasize the ineptness of Confucius's young followers in their handling of situations. I'm fascinated both by the passage's reference to callousness in the details and its use of the metaphor of tailoring to convey what is important in taking action. Using the phrase knowing to here, we would say that the followers do not know to tailor their actions to the situation. And this is partly because they do not attain appropriately to the relevant details of the situation. Instead, they fall back on acquired behaviors and practices, taking no initiative or lacking the capacity to respond appropriately to the situation. The idea of tailoring in this early text is no different from how we understand it. An early etymology of this word tie glosses it as cutting cloth for an outfit. And tailoring is just not possible if one doesn't know how to cut the cloth, or cuts it in such a way that the outfit is ill-fitting. To push the metaphor further, to tailor is to custom make. Whereas it seems Confucius's followers were taking the off-the-shelf option. Their full display of culture is a one-size-fits-all response for them. The author's choice of metaphor to capture the situation-specific nature of action is particularly compelling in my view. Next, we consider a positive example of action that is attuned to the circumstances, that is, a case of successful knowing too. So in this passage, which we'll look at, Confucius visits a temple and he asks a lot of questions. And someone who's looking on says, he's asking so many questions, surely he doesn't deserve the reputation of being a master. He's this son of a man from Zhou, referring to his father. Here's the passage. When the master went into the great ancestral temple, he asked questions about everything that took place. Someone said, who said that this son of a man from Zhou understands ritual propriety? When he went into the great ancestral temple, he had to ask questions about everything. When this comment was reported to the master, his reply was, this asking is, in fact, part of ritual propriety. Confucius' actions in the temple were criticized. His asking questions was construed as a deficit in his understanding of ritual propriety. How, then, is it possible for Confucius to have acquired his reputation for enacting ritual propriety? The critic asks. In response, Confucius defends his actions. In an environment in this temple where reverence is important, it is ritually appropriate to demonstrate one's humility. To ask questions in this context places one in a subordinate position, the position of one seeking to learn. Confucius's critic has interpreted his actions literally, as if he was eliciting information, and therefore he misses their ritual significance. By contrast, Confucius knows to act in a ritually appropriate way here, in this temple. Having identified these two examples as cases involving knowing too, let me provide some philosophical context for this idea. When I started thinking about these cases as examples of knowing too, I came across close analysis of knowing too in mathematical pedagogy, not in philosophy. And the work that influenced me was the work of two mathematicians, educationists, who were interested in mathematics education, John Mason and Mary Spence. And the work I rely on, a couple of works actually from the 1990s, and they focus on how students knowing about something, how students knowing that or showing knowing how did not guarantee their knowing to put the knowledge into practice. And this, they felt, was a particular concern for educators generally, but specifically for educators in mathematics. They draw from their experience in mathematics education to demonstrate the in-the-moment aspect of knowing too. They focus in particular on the phenomenon of a student being stuck on a particular mathematics problem. A student gets stuck, it seems that when a student gets stuck, it seems that what they have learned, knowing how to do something or knowing that something is the case, is only tangentially related to their actual performance in solving a particular problem. And this idea of getting stuck in mathematics cites work that's much earlier in the 1960s. So even though a student comprehends the basic algorithms of a particular mathematical calculation in answering a particular mathematical problem, they find that they're stuck. Let me illustrate what it means to be stuck by way of a very simple example. A square measures 4 centimeters on each of its sides. A rectangle whose area is equal to that of the square measures 2 centimeters in height. What is the length of the rectangle? This example reminds me of problem sums, we used to call them in primary school. And having grown up in Singapore, I can tell you I did my share of problem sums. Suppose there is a child who has capably demonstrated that they can calculate the areas of both squares and rectangles and who's adept at arithmetic. However, they're unable to answer this question correctly, and this is not due to carelessness, nor is it due to their not understanding what the words and the mathematical terms mean, nor is it due to their, as mentioned earlier, adeptness or lack of adeptness at arithmetic. In other words, they get stuck on the problem and are unable to operate the algorithms they're normally good at. I recall my own experience getting stuck, especially on geometry problems where you had to solve for angles. Remember these? I felt then I was just not seeing some connection, even though all the facts were there. Being given this problem and being told to solve for A, B, C, and D, you knew you could do it. There was a way to do it, but I just couldn't see the way to do it for some of these questions. I knew the angle rules, corresponding angles, angles on a straight line, angles on parallel lines, etc. It seems that getting stuck in mathematics cannot be explained by appeal to either both knowing how or knowing that. The in-the-moment apt action that is taken or not taken in the case of our student is the manifestation or lack of knowing too. I've explained in the paper how the idea of knowing too is different from the two other forms of knowing, that is knowing how and knowing that dominate philosophical inquiry in Anglo-Roman epistemology. In that paper, I demonstrated the idea of knowing too with the example of a cyclist who encounters a bump in the road. There I considered questions including whether the cyclist can successfully negotiate the bump, if she knows how to shift her weight, or to dismount, or to take some other action so that she may ride safely, and how this kind of knowledge differs in particular from know-how. So the cyclist knows how to ride a bike. She encounters a bump in the road. What does she do? Does she dismount? Does she shift her weight so that she can ride safely over the bump? Does she assess that the bump is too high to just shift her weight and therefore she has to dismount? But any of these options, dismounting, swerving, riding over the bump, they're examples, they're cases of knowing too, but they're specific to that particular bump in the road at that point in time. And supposing she reckons the bump is too high, swerving is an option, it's peak hour, then swerving is not an option. And this is what I'm trying to pull in with the idea of knowing too. But let me demonstrate the idea of knowing too now with the example of Confucius's knowing to act in a ritually appropriate manner and the great ancestral temple. First, what does it mean when we say of a person that they know how to act in a ritually appropriate way? Standardly, this person would have successfully demonstrated appropriate ritual behavior in a range of contexts and where different people are involved. Now, talking about ritually appropriate behavior may sound a little bit distant from us in culture and time, but I'd like to encourage you to think about the idea of the concept of ritual more broadly. How you greet someone, for instance, is part of our ritual, is part of our acknowledging someone's presence. How and whether you bring a gift to celebrate someone's birthday, how you receive a gift, how you answer a question, or how you disagree. I'd like to think of those practices very broadly as rituals. And different people will know to varying degrees how to behave in ritually appropriate ways. Some might be better at enacting such behavior in particular contexts. For example, a concert goer who's familiar with the proprieties of listening to a classical music performance, as opposed to someone who has their phone on. There will also be differences in the degree of know-how. One who is less adept might overdo ritual propriety, and the Analects notes that in a couple of its passages that you actually can overdo it. Against this background, what do we say of knowing too's characteristics? It is not difficult to imagine a person who has amply demonstrated he knows how to conduct himself in a ritually appropriate manner, failing to do so at the great ancestral temple. Just as in the case of a very experienced cyclist who cycles everywhere. On one occasion, they fail to navigate that bump in the road. We might say of either the cyclist or the person at the great ancestral temple that he didn't know to conduct himself in a ritually appropriate manner, or he didn't know to navigate the bump in the road. And this makes complete sense, especially if we believe they know how to do so. On the basis of this one occasion, however, we would not then quickly conclude that this person does not know how to act in ritually appropriate ways. So just because the cyclist fails to navigate the bump on the road, falls over, we don't then say, oh, he doesn't really know how to ride a bike. We don't. So there's a lack of continuity there, and it's important to point out the lack of continuity in philosophical terms to demonstrate that knowing to is a different species from knowing how. So talking about whether a person knows how does not help us explain their conduct on this one occasion, except perhaps to say it was an aberration for which we might seek to identify reasons. But it's exactly the situation-specific reasons for which we need knowing to. So let's now think through the characteristics of knowing to, particularly in relation to knowing how. I think it's quite clear how knowing to is different from knowing that, so I won't spend any time on that at all. So first, knowing how is a prerequisite for knowing to. Typically, it's not possible for someone who does not know how to practice ritual propriety to know to do so. It would seem that knowing to presupposes some level of knowing how. Discounting in instances of beginner's luck or accidental success, we would say that it's not normally possible for a person to know to act appropriately in the moment without some ability to carry through the task or activity. Second, knowing how does not guarantee knowing to. Because of Confucius' special position in the Analects, we expect that he will reliably and consistently act in ritually appropriate ways. But moving away from the Confucius figure, for anyone else, their knowing to act in such ways is not a guarantee that they will act appropriately in the particular instance, even if we typically expect that experts would have a greater chance of success. In other words, the level of know-how seems only to be loosely related to knowing to. It can help predict knowing to's success, but it cannot guarantee it. See the situation-specific nature of knowing to. Confucius' asking questions must be understood in the context of his temple visit. The ritually appropriate action of asking questions to demonstrate respect and deference has quite a different, non-literal meaning in this context. The critic of Confucius failed to grasp the context specificity of Confucius' asking questions and therefore took the literal interpretation of what Confucius was doing. It seems that the critic would not have known to act in this ritually appropriate manner, even if we allow that the critic knows how to act in ritually appropriate ways. D, there's more than one way to know to. In some situations, there may be more than one available course of action. For example, there are likely to have been a few different ways for Confucius to act in a ritually appropriate way at the temple. He could have dressed appropriately for the occasion, or walked in a reverential way, or spoken in soft tones. That a person knows to act in a ritually appropriate way in the temple is neither determined by an absolute measure, nor is it based on any one action. If, for instance, no one with a significant role at the temple was present at the time of Confucius' visit, then of course the question-asking action would not have been available. Now, some might note that this particular feature of knowing to, more than one way to know to, is not quite available in the mathematical problems of getting stuck, because there's always that one answer. But we also know that, of course, with more advanced mathematical problems, there are different ways to get to the answer, some more elegant, and the elegant ways are delightful when you get them. And I imagine too that Confucius's asking questions could possibly have been quite elegant and done so in an understated way. So let me say a little bit more about knowing to. How do we assess knowing to's success or failure? Because when you talk of knowledge, you have to talk of success or failure. Knowledge has a target. And I've briefly commented that the concept of appropriateness is a way to understand knowing to. Appropriateness captures the nature of knowing to's situation specificity. Where Confucian philosophy is concerned, the idea of appropriateness aligns with the Confucian theme of rightness, or doing the right thing. We should also note that the idea of appropriateness is not unwieldy, meaning all things to all people. It is a normative concept, consistent with there being a best action or response given the circumstances. For instance, if Confucius believed that his interlocutor, the person at the temple to whom he posed his questions, might not grasp the ritual significance of his question asking, it would be senseless for him to proceed with those questions. When thinking about knowing to, a concept that particularly comes to mind is timeliness. When we speak of timely action, we refer to the chronological dimension of an action, but we might also mean something more. For example, a joke taken out of context might have lost its punchline. It is no longer timely and therefore no longer funny. During a Q&A session after a talk, we might have something to add to a comment made by someone else, so a finger up rather than a full hand. But before we can say anything, another participant picks up the conversation, the discussion moves on, and what we could have contributed is no longer timely. To further substantiate the point that knowing to is the basic conception of knowledge in the Analects, here is a list of more of its occurrences. I won't talk through them, but I've shown you two. There are lists of knowing to set aside doubts, knowing to be moderate, to be appropriately candid, knowing to build canals and irrigation ditches. This is an interesting one. Not how to build them, but when they're needed and where to build them. Knowing to modify ritual practices, drawing out the meanings of saying of text, acting with propriety, tailoring advice to particular people, speaking at the right time, and so on, as well as examples of knowing not to. These are not just instances of knowing how cast in the language of knowing to. They are situation-specific expressions of knowledge that articulate what is needed in the specific situation. When we think of knowledge in this way, we focus on how it helps us get on in different circumstances doing what we do. In contrast to knowing how and knowing that, both of which we think about in terms of whether a person possesses knowledge, knowing to is an action-oriented conception of knowledge. It draws our attention to knowledge in context, and its situation sensitivity accommodates the things in life we care about, expressed in our undertakings and in our interactions with others. There is another metaphor in the Analects that speaks to the importance of the in-the-moment decision-making process. This is the idea of weighing trend. It can also refer to the instrument used for weighing. It's possibly like it could refer to the instrument or the activity, during the Warring States period, it's possibly like a steel yard upon which goods to be weighed will be counterbalanced by the weights at the other end. So the goods on the one end and the weights at the other. And interestingly, in Warring States literature, this metaphor of weighing was used in discussions about ethics. Just quickly mention three ways. For instance, it could be used to say that a person had or had not determined the correct views or the correct values. It could be used to indicate how a person prioritizes matters, as in they're comparing relative weights of two events. A third use of quan was to signify that some balance has been struck between two competing issues. And all these uses of the weighing metaphor require discretion. In the Analects, there are a couple of references to weighing, and I thought I'd share this one, which is interesting. The master said, you can study with some and yet not necessarily walk the same path. You can walk the same Tao as some and yet not necessarily take your stand with them. You can take your stand with them and yet not necessarily weigh things up in the same way. Confucius uses quan here as a sign of moral maturity. Even if we can study with a person, walk the same Tao, take our stand with them, we may not necessarily prioritize the heavy and the light, the important and the unimportant in the same way. In this passage, Confucius applies a metaphor specifically to communicate where fundamental value differences might lie. The idea of weighing here emphasizes the use of discretion appropriately so that one may embody the Confucian virtues. The final point I'll make in relation to knowing two in the Analects is that Confucius was known as the timely sage. So I'm going back to the idea of timeliness now. There are remarks in the Analects to this effect. But also, as importantly, later in the tradition, Mencius, a prominent Confucian thinker from the 4th century BCE, explicitly called Confucius the timely sage. And this is what Mencius says about Confucius. When Confucius decided to leave tea, he emptied the rice from the pot before it was even done and set out immediately. When he decided to leave Lu, he said, I will take my time, for this is the way to leave the state of one's parents. Moving quickly when it was appropriate to hurry, moving slowly when it was appropriate to linger, remaining in a state or taking office when the situation allowed. This is how Confucius was. Confucius was the sage whose actions were timely. This passage gives a sense of how Confucius acted reliably in a timely manner in a range of scenarios. Mencius uses these examples as a testimony to Confucius's reliability in embodying knowledge that also embraces virtue. When I began the lecture, I noted that most introductions to Confucian philosophy typically begin with its views on morality. By contrast, I've introduced the Analects through its conception of knowledge. Knowledge in particular as captured by the idea of knowing two. It seems to me that what concerned the authors of the Analects above all was how to realize their moral vision. In consequence, I've sought to present an account of the figure Confucius as an exemplar of timeliness. He knew to enact the Confucian virtues reliably. I suggest that this view of Confucius would have been important to his followers, as indeed in the way it was to Mencius. In the final section of this lecture, I'll briefly discuss how the concept of reliability in the Analects helps us better understand a Confucian conception of agency. The conception of knowing two I've sketched so far has only focused on the characteristics of knowing two. I now need to place knowing two back into a Confucian framework, the framework of a society in which exemplary people reliably manifest their knowledge in different situations. In other words, let's take a step back from the instances of knowing two to think about exemplary people who, like Confucius, consistently act in a timely manner. In Mencius's eyes, Confucius's successes in knowing two are manifestations of his exemplary life. From a person's successes or failures in some cases, we may get a sense of their reliability. So whereas looking at knowing two enables us to understand the role of knowledge in specific contexts, looking at reliability allows us to understand a person's knowing twos or not across time, that is longitudinally. So reliability affords a picture of how we sometimes succeed in acting competently or acting well, but also how we sometimes fail to do so. For the Confucians, acting well meant enacting the Confucian virtues. Over time, the moments of action viewed collectively provide a sense of a person's agency. This account of Confucian epistemology situates knowing to at the nexus of a person's commitments on the one hand and her actions on the other. In an ideal Confucian world, exemplary persons reliably manifest the Confucian virtues. Within the community, their exemplary actions reinforce norms and practices that enrich human interactions, bringing people together. As role models, exemplary persons' actions help others orient themselves within the moral landscape. In articulating this, I've come full circle to answer the question I raised at the start: how does knowledge enhance the moral life of a community? Summing up then, I've sought to offer an account of knowledge that helps us understand what's going on in the Analects. Thinking about knowledge in the Analects in terms of knowing to prompts us to rethink the traditional ways in which Anglophone philosophers think about knowledge. It helps highlight how certain presuppositions in philosophy may be more culturally specific than we have come to believe. After all, it stands to reason that how we make sense of the world is very much shaped by our needs. By these lights, we should expect that there are many different types of knowledge. The kind of knowledge that helped the authors of the Analects address their difficulties is situationally focused. A person seeks to act appropriately in response to the circumstances. This view of knowledge turns our attention to questions of agency. The early Confucians would have needed clarity of mind, shrewdness and tact, and above all, the capacity to embody the Confucian virtues by reliably putting them into practice in different contexts. In closing, I hope I've presented a plausible account of knowledge in the Analects and a compelling picture of what the early Confucians were about. I believe the text can help us develop our imaginative engagement with the struggles the Confucians faced, expand our understanding of the role of knowledge in life, and in particular, help us think about how we might know to weigh the heavy and the light. Thank you.